just, thank you. There wasn't all, there were also hundreds of Italians, there were Russians, Poles, and all the nationalities that you see there. Somehow, sometimes the Ritchie boys' name is applied to all of them. In all, there were about 5,200, but it really started with the Jewish immigrants, and that's how they're basically known, as Jewish immigrants. They were drafted, they were trained in intelligence, and then they were sent back to fight behind enemy lines. Not one person who was offered the job of going back to fight turned them down, turned the army down. Everyone who was offered the position, they wanted to get Hitler. They wanted to fight the Germans. They wanted to put the Germans in their place, and they did. Or they did a lot toward it. I want to say that my father-in-law never really talked about his experiences in the war, as I understand a lot of veterans did not. They wanted to put it behind them, and they didn't want their families to know the things that they were doing over there. And knowing what they were doing, I can understand that. But over the years, certain anecdotes did slip out. And so where there was an anecdote, it's in this book. And where there isn't an anecdote, I used the history going on around the time period and filled in with what I was told were very plausible scenes. Basically, Camp Ritchie got its name, Ritchie Boys got its name from Camp Ritchie, alternately called Fort Ritchie, Camp Ritchie. They changed the name a few times. In April, a good 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Great Britain agreed that the US could send military observers to learn intelligence gathering from the British combat units. Reason being that the British had centralized their systems under one plateau, whereas the US intelligence apparatus was split between a lot of different departments and a lot of different geographical places. And if they were going to be successful in the war, they had to centralize it. They had to have everyone knowing the same thing so that they could communicate with each other, and they had to have the same kind of rules. So the US observers went over there, they learned a hell of a lot, and they brought back some of the instructors that were teaching the British. Remember, the British had a 2-year, they were 2 years ahead of us in the war. And by 1941, the British were pretty ragged. They weren't doing so. There were a bunch of battles in the beginning that they didn't do so well, and they were more than delighted to have the U.S. come in, fresh troops, fresh equipment, and as you know, the U.S. went on a totally new economy to produce weapons for the war. The camp was in Cascade, Maryland, which is about 70 miles from Washington, D.C. And when the Secretary of War, whose name was, oh, well, I can't find it right now. It's in my notes, but I can't find it. Secretary of War got the permission to start this unit. They redid the unit, and they leased about, I don't know, 83 acres with a view of the Catoctin Mountains, which is a part of the Appalachian Blue Ridge mountain chain. And in fact, it was beautiful country. It was where all the rich people from Baltimore and DC used to go for a summer vacation. There were summer camps there. There were lakes and things like that. And in fact, FDR had a summer home a few miles away from Camp Ritchie, which was called Shangri-La. Anyone know what it's called today? Camp David, very good. That was Camp David. It was in use by FDR before. There were forests and mountains around this camp, which is just what the military needed for soldiers to practice field exercises and maneuvers and training exercises. So they the Army leased a chunk of the surrounding forests from the state of Maryland, but they had to retrofit it. It was, oh, this is another nice view. It was a mess, and they had $5 million to build housing, to classrooms, cafeterias, a mess hall. They had to put in a new water system. And this was they began working in 1942, in the beginning of 1942. And the first class came in October of 1942. So the place was still filled with mud and, 2x4s everywhere. And it was just a mess. But that's where they started the training. They did have the classrooms done, they did have the mess hall done, and they did have the water system done. And that was the important stuff. No, actually, they started in July of 42. I'm wrong. And they didn't have the barracks yet. They had the first class had to live in tents. The camp eventually had a theater, 2 tennis courts, and 2 man-made lakes that were used for boating and swimming, and also to practice water landings and things like that on the rivers in Europe. There was a chapel which was used in an ecumenical way for Protestant Catholics and Jewish religious services. Let's see here. Where do I want to go here? Everything at Camp Ritchie was totally secret. Nobody knew about it, which is one of the reasons why nobody knows about it today. The recruits could not tell their families where they were. All they could say is things are fine, things are wonderful. And if anyone did tell and they found out, they were out of the program. In fact, you will find as I keep going that this was a very strict program, and the recruits were expected to learn, I want to say, well, I'll just say it, a hell of a lot of information in a very short period of time. And they were quizzed on it, and they had final exams and everything else. And the upshot was that, let's say, of a class of maybe 36 potential Ritchie boys, only 30% graduated. The other 60% were kicked out or didn't make the grade or whatever. So it was pretty rigorous training. So the Ritchie boys served first in North Africa. Oh, wait. Okay. In North Africa, they got in there at the end of the Rommel being all over North Africa, and they helped win some of the battles over there. Then we do know that they also had some Japanese Ritchie boys, but because Japan had declared war on us, they were not allowed to fight. There were non-combat positions that some Ritchie boys had, and I'll talk about that in just a second about the research. So a lot of the Japanese were in non-combat positions, or they were learning how to do psych ops or propaganda, and so there was a place for them. It was only at the end of the war that the Japanese Americans were allowed. However, most of the Ritchie boys were sent to the European theater. This is something that goes on. I know it's it's hard to see, but they were sent basically to France and Belgium, and they were also sent to England, where they were additionally trained, and then they were also up in Scotland, where they were actually doing some work up there. No one called any of the recruits Ritchie boys during World War II. As I mentioned, let's talk a little bit now about the training. By the way, I guess I had a picture of the head of the Ritchie of the camp, And his name was Charles, started with a B. I don't know what happened to it, but he was kind of he fashioned himself after Patton. He thought of himself as a Patton type of guy. And he was very salty language and ruled with an iron fist, but he was very fair to everyone. And he was a good leader. He was promoted to general. So the best way to think about the training is like a university. And there were 20,000 people that came through Camp Ritchie during the war. Of them, 5,200 were the Ritchie boys, which I already mentioned to you, then from Germany. Then there were, of whom 2,800 were German, or 2,300. There's never been, everywhere I looked, there was a different number of how many they were. The closest I got was 2,300, but somehow I put in 2,800 there. A few hundred Italian, and then 2,000 others. They only had an 8-week training. And that is barely enough to teach them the skills that they needed in the field. There he is, Banfield. There's Mr. Banfield on the left. And on the right is one of the British officers that came in. I gotta move him up. I'm sorry, it was a little out of place. Let's talk a little bit about the classes. Because it was a new, because it was a new unit and because it was a new department for the Army, they were given pretty much, if Banfield wanted something, he got it. He would ask for things and he got more amazing stuff at Camp Ritchie. There is now a Camp Ritchie museum with some of the actual uniforms that they got. And for example, the one thing they could not get is Russian tanks. But what they did was they made out of plywood, they covered American tanks with the German insignias and the German, and painted them, and they looked just like German tanks. And Ritchie boys were definitely trained on how to maneuver a tank, both the US tanks as well as the German tanks. And if they failed that was one of the reasons why they would get kicked out. They were required to know every conceivable thing that was on the German uniform. In fact, there was a huge class about that, which you'll see in a minute, and the Japanese uniform, because if they were out in the field and they came across a German unit, they had to figure out who was the leader, who was the second in command, who were just the soldiers in the unit, and where they were going and where they had been. There was a bicycle unit. I guess that was used in Britain mostly, and in places in France. There was a horse unit, although I don't know where that was actually used. There was, okay, and well, we'll get to it. The most important classes was something called the Order of Battle, how to interrogate German POWs, which was their main job, and then counterintelligence, which was also their main job. Order of battle goes into some of the things I mentioned. There was an incredibly difficult class where they had to, somebody wants to come in, where they had to figure out everything that they could figure out about the uniforms. What the decals meant, and the Germans were always changing those things sometimes. And at the beginning, they had decals where you could actually tell what unit they were in. And then when they realized that the Americans were figuring that out, they stopped that decal and they had something else. But they also had okay. They also had to, there was, and the great thing was there was no red tape for Banfield. As I said, he pretty much got what he wanted. So order of battle was German and enemy uniforms and ranks, the insignias on the jackets, on the lapels, and the collars. They had to learn enemy machinery, which included the weapons, the guns, and the bazookas, and the other weapons, as well as the machinery that was used, the trucks and the tanks. They had to learn how the Germans would go from one place to another. Did they walk? Were they marched? Did they get on the back of trucks? And then they were tested on all of this. Now, all of this, they also had to know all of the platoons and all of the German units that they might come across, depending on where they were stationed. And all of this went into something called the Red Book. And the Red Book it was a compendium of all the knowledge that the Ritchie boys might have to use. And they were expected to memorize what was pertinent to their position and where they were. Before they went, they could not take the Red Book with them, because if they were caught by the Germans and taken prisoner, the Germans would know exactly what the Americans knew or would be finding out. So that was a huge class in and of itself. They had to know the airplanes, and here you see a teacher in a German uniform, which they were able to get, talking about the insignias on another soldier's uniform. And I have a great scene in the book where Max is tested on what he knows about the German uniforms. And Max is a good student, and he passes. Of course, Max is a hero, as you will find out. He was one of the ones that made it out. Anyway, the second class, and probably the one that was most important, was how to interrogate prisoners of war. And I have a very detailed scene with a mock interrogation going, where Max is being asked to interrogate an instructor who's playing a German, and they make it difficult for him, and he makes a mistake, but it wasn't a horrible mistake. So he passed that one. But the Geneva Convention says that you could not touch another prisoner in any way. But the Germans did not respect that, and neither did the Russians. But what the US did, but there were ways that they could function without touching them. They could make the POWs stand for hours, not allow themselves to relieve themselves, deprive them of food or of heat. If it was really hot, they could amplify the heat. If it was really cold, they could make it colder by opening the tent flap doors. Most of these interrogations took place inside, in an interior or in a tent. So that really helped. And a majority of the POWs were just young men like them. And a lot of them were not Hitler supporters. They were just doing their job because they'd been drafted. And so they were kind of relieved that they'd been caught, because that meant that they wouldn't be in the field anymore. Plus, everyone wanted to be caught because the Americans treated the POWs so well. They gave them 3 meals a day. They gave them books to read. They gave them, after they had been deployed. Did you know, you knew that there were a lot of POW camps here in the States, right? And there were 5 POW camps right around Chicago. One of them was in Glenview, across from Hackney's on Harms. That there was a POW camp there. Who knew? The interrogator always started off with a statement that made the POW think the interrogator already knew everything and more about the platoon or the unit that the POW was in. And this was why it was so important for them to study the order of battle. He could use the leaders' names. He could use the names of other enemy unit people. He could cite statistics or a recent battle situation. He could talk about the morale in the unit, or he could ask about it. He could the objective was to make this soldier think, well, if he knows this already, I may as well talk because he already knows everything he needs to know. The biggest fear that the Germans had was being captured by the Soviets, because they all knew that the Soviets were horrible. The treatment was just horrible, and that the odds were they wouldn't come out of a Soviet POW camp. So an interrogator might dress as a Soviet officer if one of the German POWs was not talking, and pretend to be ready to take the prisoner to a Soviet camp. To Soviet camp, if they didn't talk to the American. Another strategy was to pretend to be a German POW themselves. And Fred, one of the anecdotes of my father-in-law was that he and another guy in the OSS, he was in the OSS, but they were doing exactly the same thing as the Ritchie boys were. They were interrogating POWs and they were doing counterintelligence. And he and his friend decided that his friend would play the interrogator and he would play a POW. And so he got into the tent with the other guy, and he made the other guy feel comfortable, and he made up some story about where he'd been and what he'd been doing. And the POW started to trust him. And within 24 hours, he was telling Fred everything that Fred would have wanted to know had he been interrogating him. And the day after that, the POW was going to be adjudicated by the unit to decide where to send him. And Fred dressed up in his US uniform at that point and was there when the real German POW came, and he looked at Fred and he was just like, oh my God, I was such a sucker, So that was a good deal for Fred. He was very happy with that particular anecdote. Sometimes the training staff included professional athletes and artists and actors who played difficult prisoners or POWs, or who spoke in dialects that were hard for the interrogators to understand. And sometimes the military even brought real prisoners of war, because there were some in Maryland, so that the camp students could practice their technique. At the end of training, the trainees had to successfully interrogate one of their instructors in order to graduate. Afterwards, those who were trained as interrogators were formed into teams of 6, and which usually consisted of 1 officer and 3 or 4 enlisted men. Some were sent for further training, or some were assigned to divisions already fighting in North Africa, Europe, or even the Pacific, or they were given secret intelligence agency jobs in the US or Britain. There were a lot of Ritchie boys that ended up staying in Britain as part of MI6. Counterintelligence was a wholly different. And it is probably one of the broadest subjects that they had to deal with, because there was so many different types of things that they could do. There was terrain intelligence. What did the land look like? There was aerial intelligence. If you were in a plane and you had a picture of looking down on the ground, what was down there? There was signal intelligence, how they communicated with each other. So they had to do a little bit of each. And I knew that, you know, Max couldn't be perfect, my hero. So I had him fail the test on aerial intelligence. He could not tell, looking at a shot that was taken from the air, what was on the ground. And the reason I picked that is because I couldn't tell what was on the ground from aerial. I mean, was it a building? Was it, you know, a store? Was it, you know, was it a war? Something to do with the war? It was hard to tell. It was hard to tell the terrain, you know, was it hilly or was it flat? Because there were so many there was so much wood and forests around them. Signal intelligence, well, here you have somebody looking at terrain. They had a lot of maps and someone looking at the terrain situation. Here you have the photo intelligence center, which is where the aerial photos would be, and some of the signal intelligence. Here you have all of the Ritchie boys had to learn Morse code, and they had to learn it more than just basic. And in fact, I'm not sure, I don't know what, 40 words a minute, maybe, they had to learn. And if they didn't, they were out, you know? They had to do radio intelligence. They had to learn how to operate the radios back and forth. And they also had to learn how to operate the radios that had the antennas, where they would raise the antenna and report back to the generals what was going on in a situation. And so all of that was difficult to learn and difficult to work. Let's see. Yeah, there were mobile radio broadcasts. A few were even trained to work with carrier pigeons, believe it or not, for signal intelligence. Oh, how that worked, I have no idea. And other elements of counterintelligence, they used, this was really interesting. They built what's called a cutout house, kind of like in Hollywood, where you have one side of the house looks normal, and then the other side of the house, you see that it's just a fake. It's just, they did that. And they had drills on how to capture a house, how to take the captives in the house without harming them, and how to case it, how to look for important documents or records that might be in an office that they took to get intel. There were professional wrestlers that taught them how to do close combat. They had to write reports. They had disguises that they might use. And there are several scenes that I put in there at the Battle of the Bulge, where some of those techniques were used, and Max used them pretty well. There was also a German village. They built an entire German village at the camp, and they transferred the training to a pub or a bell tower, or, you know, a store, how to case the store, how to get all of those things. There was a church somewhere in here, and maybe it was on top of the bell tower. And that is the bell tower has an interesting story to it, which I hope I'll get to in a minute. They had to learn German. Hold on. Here we go. Yeah, they had to learn the weapons, they had to learn the tanks, they had to deal with the horses. And in addition, for some reason, they were still marched. I don't know why they had them marching back and forth, but they did. In addition to marching in good and bad weather, they learned camouflage. And here you see on the left, there's someone in a stack of corn. That would have been during the training. But on the right, you see a sniper nest in the woods, and they were taught how to make those as well. Then they also, I mentioned this before, they had a theater and they would do plays for the Ritchie boys, for all the Ritchie boys. And most of it was, don't talk, loose lips, sink ships, that kind of thing. But they would bring actors and actresses from around the community to come in and talk to them as long as they had been cleared. And they had, this was really interesting, every 6 weeks, they had a fake German rally. And they had a guy named Hitler, but I couldn't find any good pictures of him. So this is someone being born. And they had actors play the German soldiers, and the German soldiers were incredibly enthusiastic and cheering and everything. And that was important for the Ritchie boys to know, because they wanted them to know how the ethos of the Germans what their environment, what their mood was like, so that they'd be prepared for it. Nearby was a couple of ancillary camps. One was called Camp Greentop, and that was an OSS camp. So, and then there was a camp that was right across the Maryland border in Pennsylvania, near Gettysburg, where it was called, a woman wrote a book about it called The Psycho Boys, and that was all about propaganda, dropping leaflets, doing fake radio broadcasts, publishing fake news stories. It's called disinformation. We all know about that, but that is when it really hit in during World War II. Famous Ritchie boys. We were talking about this earlier. They weren't all German Jews. They're David Rockefeller, J.D. Salinger, Frank Church, Sloane Coffin, Chafee, that's who I was trying to remember, Governor John Chafee of Rhode Island. There was even a prince from Spain, William Krymer, Robert Rodenberg, founder of the Baltimore Colts. And how many of you have relatives that you know were Ritchie boys? I know Vanessa does. I'll bet you do when you don't know it. Maybe your grandfather, maybe your uncle, maybe your great uncle, maybe it would be good for you to, it would be interesting for you to maybe comb your family archives and find out what people did during World War II. You're the ones that were in the service. The reason we had trouble figuring out what Fred really did during the war is that the Army opened a new record center at like 1963, 65 in St. Louis. And shortly after it opened, there was a terrible fire. And the fire burned most of the records of servicemen who were in World War II, and his was gone. In fact, I did get some information from the archives about Fred, and I got, believe it or not, I got a card when he, what do you call it, when you get out, you meet her? No, there's when you, anyway, when he was discharged, and the card showed that he still owed the Army like $11 for laundry or something like that. But it had his serial number. And that was really a godsend, because we wanted to know his serial number, because we still need to do some more research. And you probably know that German descendants of Holocaust victims can apply for German citizenship. And my kids are doing that. So I don't know. And in order to do that, they needed his serial number in the US Army. So we were really lucky to find that. I will be happy to answer questions, because I know I went through a lot of information very quickly, and I was a little ragged because I was trying to edit as I went to not give you information that you wouldn't want to know. But oh, I want to tell you how he got out of the Netherlands. And this is true. This is a true story. He had to get from Amsterdam to Rotterdam. which is where the ships took off for America. He got into a truck, and in the back of the truck were coffins. And he had to lie in a coffin for the entire trip because if anyone stopped him, he had to, pretend they were dead. And he said the smell was just, it had been used. It was a used coffin, but nobody was in it now. So that's how he got out. And then he got a ship and got to Philadelphia. Anyway. Oh, okay. Yes,
My late husband, he came from Austria to America, and he went straight to the army because of his language. But that doesn't mean he was automatically a Ritchie boy.
No.
No, okay.
No.
Okay.
No. They did interviews. Yeah. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Her late husband, was from Austria, and he did.
He immigrated to that.
Yeah, he was in the war, but he wasn't a Ritchie boy. It was.
Had to translate it.
Yes, yeah. Well, interrogate was a little bit more active than translating, but a lot of them did translate. And a lot of the Japanese Americans translated from the Japanese texts because they couldn't fight. But yeah, no, the Ritchie boys were supposedly vetted pretty carefully by the people that wanted them, and maybe he was too young, maybe he was too old, maybe.
No.
Yeah, that could have been. Because they only had 8 weeks to train them.
Yeah.
It's just impossible for me to think. I mean, I would have flunked out. I know that. Anyway.
Question.
Selected, or did they volunteer once they were in the service, and how long did they remain a Ritchie boy? Was it a short term, or was it the whole time that they were in?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Okay.
Go back.
They selected. How did they get into the program? Did they volunteer?
It was after basic training. They were asked what they wanted to do. When you finish basic training, you say what you want to do, and you list 3 or 4 things, and you have the Army manual to tell you. And then the people that will interview you for your further training specialization will decide whether, if you have an accent, if you have a German accent and you seem to be pretty put together and pretty stable, they might ask you if you were interested in a program that would take you back behind German lines. So they were offered, and I don't think, as I told you, no one declined the offer. These were young men who really wanted to fight the Nazis, and they did.
How long did the Ritchie boys?
The camp closed in 1946, but when the war ended, some of the Ritchie boys were done and they came back to the US. Others were offered jobs. Fred was offered, even though he was in the OSS, he was offered a job in the OSS to stay in Europe and help interview Germans who had been who worked for the war effort, and decide whether they should be incarcerated or whether they were just doing their jobs and they could continue. Because remember, when the war was over, Germany needed to, the Americans, the French, and the British had to reconstitute Germany. And these people who were in positions in the municipalities and in the city governments and in the province governments knew their jobs and they could be helpful. So there were 3 classes. They were, no, you're not to be trusted. You're going that way. Yes, you can stay where you are. And yes, we're really sorry. And we're going to give you a great job or something like that.
Is the camp in use today for anything, or is
the camp? The camp is not used for anything except that it is now the home of the Ritchie Boy Museum. And I do want to note that if you do have relatives who were Ritchie boys, there's going to be a Ritchie Boy family reunion at the camp this summer, July 26th. And if you Google Ritchie Boy Museum, you'll find out more about it and see if you want to go. When I was at a different synagogue here, there were three people who had Ritchie Boy uncles and a Ritchie Boy father, and they're going to go. So that's kind of fun.
1 second, wait.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so they're working behind, how many got caught?
How many?
Unfortunately, two men were caught, and the way that they were caught, it was during the middle of a brutal situation in the field. They talked they were fluent in German, but they had an accent that wasn't German. And some of the soldiers in the unit went to their commanding officer and said, I don't know about these guys. They had told them they were from a nearby unit, and that their nearby unit was decimated and they were the only survivors, but they didn't talk right. They had accent problems. They were executed, unfortunately.
Were they given the opportunity to look for relatives that had been left behind in Germany?
Yes, yes. And in fact, Max tried to look for his parents, but he kind of knew that no, he did know that they were gone, but he was trying to look for they had, in fact, Max, after the war, he was offered a job and he decided to take it. And he went back to Regensburg for a year. This is in my book. And he was, in Regensburg was the largest refugee camp in all of Europe. So a lot of displaced refugees who'd been in camps or who'd been in other places or who'd been hidden ended up in that camp. And he ended up seeing some people he knew from his childhood, which I thought was an interesting way to kind of wind up the story.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Not really a question. I heard you do this a year ago. You're fantastic. That's why we came today.
Thank you.
It's a
Thank you
wonderful
very much. Sorry, I was a little ragged. I felt a little ragged.
one.
Well, thank you so much. I hope, okay, so here's the anecdote, and then here's the anecdote I wanted to tell you. What was, oh God, it just went out of my mind. Having a senior moment, not. Okay, give me a minute. Oh, I remember now. So
You had mentioned the bell tower.
yeah, the bell tower, and I'll tell that in a second. But okay, I'll tell the bell tower now. When the first Americans conquered I think it was Saint-Église, a town in France, the way they did it was they went up into the bell tower of the town and they shot down. They didn't shoot people, they just shot so that the villagers would know they meant business. And within 24 hours, the town surrendered. Saint-Église to something. And that was the first victory that the US Army had in France, which gives me shit. Okay, so I was at a World War II air show in Pennsylvania, Allentown, near Allentown, Pennsylvania. And it was, I don't know if you've ever been to these World War II shows, but they're crazy. There are thousands of people, and the women are all dressed in 1940s uniforms, and the men are all dressed in, most of them are soldiers. And then they have someone playing Eisenhower riding around in a Jeep, and they have a Hitler riding around, and they have like a cutout little village. And they have, of course, all the planes that you have. Well, the Ritchie Boy Museum asked me to join them at this air show. And I'm like, sure, why not? I've never been to an air show. And so we had a booth. It was really just a table, and I had my books, and they had information about the museum. And everybody that came up to our table, we'd say, have you ever heard of the Ritchie boys? Thinking that, well, these are World War II people. 99% had never heard of the Ritchie boys. Never heard of them. And after the show, we just said we still have a lot of work to do.
Probably Jewish.
Exactly. Exactly. I wasn't going to say that. I wasn't going to say that, but you said it. You can say it. Anyway, thank you for sharing some of your Sunday with me. I appreciate it. And if you'd like to buy a book, they're $20. And I take credit cards and cash and checks. Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a great morning, afternoon. And next week is Ben Zeller and watch your Macomb at home. Bye-bye, everyone. I gotta look at it. Ooh. Ugh. Yes. Here is now.